Stephen.
Oh, we're doing a Feuertip. That's right.
We're doing a Feuertip. It's Wednesday, 11 a.m. What else would we be doing?
Yeah, that's right. Certainly nothing better to do than get online and do a Feuertip.
Stephen, it's snowing here in Montreal today.
That's snowing. So nice. I got to say, I miss snow. I lived in Chicago for 30 years. Now I'm in North Carolina. 3 years ago, a month after I moved to North Carolina, we had a 9-inch snow day. That was crazy here, but very little since then. And snow is really quite beautiful and wonderful. So enjoy. I'm so jealous.
Not really. Beautiful and wonderful in the middle of the winter, but not like April 21st. We're ready for some spring, and it sort of teased us. We had some beautiful weather, and here we go again. What can you do? So you've got a tip for us today. We teased out, we're talking exception handlers today, or the exception handling block. You are going to tell us what we should and should not be putting in there.
And I got to say, your sound is a bit garbled. Hopefully it cleans up, and hopefully mine is clear.
Yours is clear. So I will stop talking and let you talk.
We'll dive in. And actually, we're going to do I'm going to do one new thing this week, and hopefully you'll like it, and I'll do it every week, which is I'm going to talk to you about one of the books I have read, and one of my favorite books over the years. When I was doing office hours at Oracle, a couple of people would ask, Stephen, talk about your bookshelf. So I figure, what the heck, I'll talk about my bookshelf a little bit each week at the end. So we're going to start off, of course, with our tip. And the tip is, or the question, the lead-in is, what's in your exception section? And that's a riff on Capital One ads. What's in your wallet? Hopefully you got it. If not, dumb move on my part. Anyway, what is in your exception section? So the answer to that question should be, the only thing I have in my exception section is code I need to handle the exception, log the exception, re-raise it, whatever. Things to do with exception handling. And what you don't want in your exception section is application code. So what I want to do is walk through a few examples of this. And I'll ask you, in some cases, to tell me what you think could be done about this. You can even tell me why you don't think it's a problem. That's fine. And then among all the folks who ask questions, answer questions, offer tips, Michelle is going to pick one lucky winner who will choose our nonprofit to give some of InSum's money to help heal our planet. Okay, so let's go ahead and share my screen, and I'll move my face out of the way. And we'll get started. So here's the first piece of code I want to start with, and I think you'll see some common patterns in the code I'm going to show you, and I bet you have some of your own. If you have examples of this, please feel free to post them in the chat or send them to me via email. In fact, my email, in case anybody doesn't know this now, is my name, more or less, at InSum. Okay, so here's a piece of code in which I'm saying, well, I've got a favorite games table, and I'm going to insert into my favorite games table. My favorite game is Farkle. It's a game I've started playing with my mom in the recent year or so, and it's a dice game. It's kind of fun. Check it out. But there's a unique index on name and game, and so if I've already got a row in there, so if there's already a row, I guess actually a unique index on name, if there's already a row in there, then I'm going to update my favorite game and set it to Farkle for that person. Okay, so here's the basic anti-pattern to look for. I raised an exception, something went wrong. And in that exception section, what I should be asking is, or what I should be doing is logging what went wrong. But instead what I'm doing is saying, I've already got a row in there for Stephen's favorite game. Let's change it to his new favorite game. Now, let me first of all make a point that in pretty much all the examples I'm going to show you today, you're going to say, what's the big deal, Stephen? I can see the flow of the logic here. Obviously, it's no big deal. And it's true for very small program units like this, not a big deal. But in real world code, you might have a very large procedure or more than 30 or 40, 50 lines long. The exception section will be out of sight. Therefore, you have to know from reading the code what's going to happen. You'll see a great example of this with Util File in a moment, and go down to that very different section in your code to find the rest of your application logic. It's just a pretty bad idea. Okay, so my question to you is, what should this be instead if it's not this? Any thoughts about what it should be instead?
Kevin jumped right in and has a solution, a suggestion here.
Yes, Kevin.
And Stephen, how is my sound before I get all nervous?
Good now.
Okay, good.
Yes, so Kevin came up with the really good solution, which is, let's get up to the, oh no, now SQL Developer is going to freeze and reset itself running on the cloud, so it's going to do that. But anyway, Kevin's idea was to change it to simply a merge. And you'll see an example of that merge statement in just a moment. I should have done something about this beforehand, but it is reconnecting to my cloud database. Right. So in this case, in this simple example, in fact, the heck with that. Let's start with Sublime. So I'm simply not going to. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay. So instead, we can do a merge. Right. We're going to check on Steve on the name. If it's equal to Stephen, if we have a match, then do an update. If we don't have a match, then do an insert. Excellent work, Kevin. Now, that's nice. Of course, in many, many cases, the pattern is not as simple as that. Let's take a look at a variation on that, which I think is also something you might run into a fair amount. And that is, I've got a procedure, create user. I pass in the username, pass in the user source. I can't even remember what that's for. Anyway, I'm going to see if the person exists for that name. And then if that person doesn't exist, I'm going to do an insert. And again, it's the same pattern of here's my executable section. This is the stuff the procedure is doing. And I look, it's like, wow, that's not doing much of anything. I select the ID and I don't even do anything with it. So that's not creating a user. Oh, right. If I don't find a user, it raises no data found. Then I go down here. You see how you have to understand the logic of PL SQL and how specific statements operate. A select into raises no data found in order to find the right place in your code.
Stephen, you're in the second Feuer tip when you talked good lazy, bad lazy. I don't know if you remember, but Marlon suggested this as an example of bad lazy.
Mm-hmm. So this would be an example, a common example, I'd say, of bad or kind of bad lazy. Yeah, kind of that's right. So the question is, what would we do with this? Any thoughts about how I could change this code so that either I'm not raising an exception, or at least I'm not forced to find the rest of my application logic down in the exception section?
Let's see if Kevin is still paying attention.
Kevin,
we're counting on you.
Oh, and Kevin is the one who asked about my bookshelf. Cool.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I don't hear a quick answer, so let's just keep on going. Here's a couple of alternative approaches. So one is I'm going to stick with my select into, but I'm going to use a nested block to narrow the propagation of the exception. That's one of the two really good reasons to use a nested block. Narrow down the propagation of an exception, basically cut it short, or declare local variables that are only to be used in that particular part of the code. So I'm going to trap the exception, and it says, well, I don't have an ID then. Okay, and then if I don't have an ID, do an insert. Now, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't have an exception section down here. There's certainly a good reason to generally have an exception section. But in this case, what I'm also saying in my code is, this is not an exception. Oracle treats no data found as an exception for select into, but it's really a different data condition. So I'm going to trap it, convert it into a data set, a data condition, and then use that logic here.
So, Stephen, loads of people have commented since you asked your question earlier. So Ashish is suggesting update first and then SQL not found, then the insert.
So, right, and so there are actually a lot of ways to address this scenario. And in fact, I'm writing a blog post on how to write one row selects, single row selects, and all the different possibilities. So I'll touch on some of this briefly here, but I'm going to save most of it for our next or a future Feuer tip. So the thing that you need to take into account when you're deciding what pattern to follow for single row selects that drive logic is whether or not it will mostly succeed or mostly fail, because exception handling is pretty slow. For example, I can completely avoid exception handling with a different approach. I can have an explicit cursor, and then I open and fetch. And if I don't find a row, insert it. And that's it. Done. No possibility of a no data found related exception being raised. All the logic right here clearly expressed in the executable section of code.
Niels mentions just selecting account star, and if there's 0 records, insert the user.
Yeah, so I'm going to keep going because these are great points, but we're going to take it up in a future Feuer tip that really just drills into excruciating detail around single row selects and and the different factors involved. So let's go back to my application code. Great. Let's go back and look at another one. So now we've looked at an example relating to SQL operations. Cool. Let's take a look at something that's simply procedural. I don't know how many of you use Util File. It's a package that was used a lot in the past to read and write files from PL SQL. In the world of the cloud, that's pretty much, we're done with that. You're not reading and writing files. You've got object storage, whatever the complexities are. But in the good old days, I might have said, well, I want to process this file. You pass in the directory, the file name. I'm going to open my file. And then I'm going to loop through the file. Now, take a look at this piece of code. This is pretty funny. Not funny, but I need to do something with each line in the file. And here's my entire executable section. Go through the file and get the stuff out and drop it into an array. It's like, what? I'm not doing anything with the lines of code. What's going on here? Well, similarly to a select into, oddly enough, it's the same exception. When you read past the end of a file in Util File, and you have to know this, it raises no data found. So right here in my exception section, I have true application logic. Okay, now I'm going to go through all the lines in my lines in my file in the array and do whatever I'm going to do with that stuff, and then close the file. Now you can see, I hope you can see how this would make someone nervous. For example, just again looking at the exception section and the executable section, I'm not even closing the file. What sort of lazy, dangerous programmer am I anyway? So here you have this separation between the loading up, basically the reading of the file. And then when I'm done, I have to know that it's going to raise no data found and send me off to another section of code. Again, really bad idea. So as an alternative, it's similar to, I think, probably what you've seen, what we were talking about previously, but I'll just go ahead and run through this. So now let's take a look at the executable section of this file, of this program. Open the file. While I'm not at the end of the file, get the next line. And that tells me whether or not I'm at the end of the file. And then when I'm done, go through all the lines in the file and do my processing. And then close my file. Now, hopefully, this flow makes perfect sense to you, right? It's very readable while not end of file. And of course, pretty much it's the way util file get line should have been written to begin with. Pass back a Boolean flag indicating whether or not I've read past the end of the file. Not raising no data found. But we can't change util file. What we can do is change how we use it. So when I used to use util file a lot, what I would do is create a little procedure, basically a replacement for getLine, which passes the line out, but also tells me whether or not I reached end of file. And all I'm doing in this little procedure is converting no data found to a Boolean flag of true. And that allows me to then write much more well-structured code, much easier to follow and maintain. So that, in a nutshell, is my tip for today. Let's see, I have one more example here. This is relating more to error handling, but in a way it's similar. So what I'm doing here is raising an exception, whatever I'm doing in my code, and my when others, it's error handling code. So it's not inappropriate to have it here, but it's inappropriate to log errors this way. So you should never expose the way that you're logging errors in your exception section. First of all, you'd be doing it over and over and over and over and over again. And there's a very good chance that you'd wipe out your error log when you raise and then roll back in a higher block. Or you might say, oh, I'm going to commit to save this line, but then you're committing everything in your session. So it should really be an autonomous transaction. It should really be its own separate procedure. So again, just a little plug for generic error handling. You should never have this kind of exposure of your logic, of your error logging code in your exception handler. And just as a little item here that I'll probably come back to in the future, we're now working on building a utility on top of Apex Debug that we can leverage in Apex applications to do error logging in a very simple, clean fashion. And I'll almost certainly report on that later. Okay, so that's my tip. Keep your application logic out of your exception section. Find a way to move it into the executable section. Your code will end up being much more readable, much less scary to other people coming along later and saying, oh my God, it's an infinite loop. It's never, where is that? It's never going to stop. Wherever I put that, this just looks so scary, right? And in general, as you probably heard me say before, you want to write code that answers questions, doesn't raise questions in people's minds.
Right. And we're using the exception block for exception handling. Right. Kevin is asking,
can you stop my share? And then I'll take a look.
I can stop your share.
So how about using DBMS utility format error backtrace and error handling sections to give more details of the error? Absolutely, Kevin. But the thing is, you should be calling a procedure to log your error. And that procedure, that generic procedure, can get format call stack, format error backtrace, SQL code. It can get all the generic stuff known in your session through these functions. The only thing you really want to put in your exception handler section is or past your generic handler are things like the value of local variables and parameters that would help you diagnose why you had an error. So generally speaking, things like logger and our own homegrown generic utilities can automatically grab the session-wide stuff, but the application-specific stuff, there's no way to get at unless you give it to us through that API. So let's see. There were a number of other comments here. Judith had a couple about 2 sessions attempting simultaneously. One of them might still get dupe val and index on the insert. No question, Judith. Good points. I wasn't trying to write robust multi-user code. They're just pointing out some bad patterns and some ways perhaps to get it. And as Niels points out, you could catch the exception in a loop and then do an exit. So there are a number of other possibilities there. Yep. And then Tufik is asking, when others then raise, isn't this too stupid? Well, I don't think we should call each other's code stupid. And I've probably written that in the past. So no. So I think what the nice way to frame that, Tufik, can you put it back up actually for a second?
Sure.
When others then raise adds 0 value and in fact detracts from your ability to diagnose the error later. So when others then raise is the same thing as letting it go unhandled. No when others. The difference being that if you have a when others then raise and the exception propagates out several layers up, when I call DBMS utility format error backtrace or the util call stack equivalent, it'll trace back to this line, not the line that originally raised the exception. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to do a when others then raise, before you raise, you must log the error and add that local context information. Now, Tom Kite, famously, has recommended for years, he might still be recommending it wherever he is in Colorado, living in a tent or whatever he's doing. He would say, don't have any local exception handlers. Let it bubble up to the top and then call format error backtrace and you can trace back. And it's true. You don't have to trap and re-raise every way up. At the very top, you'll still get that backtrace all the way back down to the line that raised the error, but you'll lose all the local context along the way. So I prefer to handle and log in each block as I'm propagating out.
I think I remember seeing you do a webinar or something about that, about the we just discussed, and was it with Tom as well about where? I
didn't do it with Tom. Tom and I didn't appear publicly together. We didn't want to confuse people. And the thing is, he was always right, and I was always wrong. And in terms of general database things, he had a very different perspective on a number of aspects of PL SQL coding from me. And I happen to think that was mostly relating to the kind of applications he built compared to the kind of applications I built. Certainly, there are certain guidelines that are valid across the board. There are others that make more or less sense depending on the kind of things you built or need to build. But I've certainly talked about that point before. In fact, I can't imagine that there's any point I will ever say about PL SQL that I haven't made numerous times before. So Kevin has a great point here. Mm-hmm. To me, coding is all about communication. I hate fancy coding. I like simple code. I consider myself a citizen developer. I know enough to get my job done. Kevin, I feel the same way. I have long considered myself to be a total amateur when it comes to programming. I just got lucky and get paid for it. And you're right, coding is about communication. Really, you should think about your code as telling a story. Somebody should be able to come to your code later and literally be able to read through it. That's why the way you name things is so important. It's the way you structure things is so important. If people stumble around, and in fact, one great way to improve your code is to try to read it out loud. You could read it to yourself. You could read it to a little rubber ducky. You could read it to your friend. And as you start to stumble, if you're explaining your code by reading it and you stumble, that's a point where you might need to put in a comment or restructure it a little bit or rename it a little bit to make it smoother. Great point.
If you're Anton, you read to a plant, a potted plant.
Is that it? He reads to a plant?
He does.
All right.
So I don't know if you agree with me, Stephen, but Kevin's had some great comments today, great participation. We had some great engagement from Ludit, from Ashish, from Phil, from Umesh, Niels is back again this week. But since you've given me executive powers today, I pick Kevin to be to choose the charity for this week. Do you agree?
I agree.
Great. So Kevin, if you can pop in the comments. I better share my screen quickly. Just as a reminder to everybody, every week we ask somebody to pick one of 3 charities that we will be donating to $25 to. So we've got the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust. I think Niels picked Sheldrick last week. Center for Biological Diversity, and Earthwatch. So Kevin, if you have a minute to give it some thought and pop it in the comments.
That'll be great. And Kevin also says, I spend a lot of time writing good formatted logs for my programs. When I or another person read the log should also tell a story. You're right. Instrumentation is really critical to not reading the code itself, but reading what the code did at any point. If you can turn on trace and then read your log and say, it did this, then it did that, then it did this. Here's what went wrong. Very valuable stuff. Okay, so feel free to keep the comments coming.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch to my, sorry?
Yeah, go ahead. You're going to switch to the
Kevin,
book.
do let us know which nonprofit you would prefer us to send the $25 to. So what I'd like to do is introduce you to one of my favorite recent books, Earthwatch. Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Back in about 2011, for some reason, I decided that it was time for me to remind myself of what evolution by natural selection actually is. I learned about it years and years ago and, accepted it as fact, but never really paid attention. And I just went on this blitz of reading dozens of books and, kind of exploring what the current scientific knowledge is about evolution. And it blew me away and it changed my life in so many ways. And one of the books that I read that really, really had a big impact is called Among the Bears by a guy named Ben Killam. And if you could share my screen again.
Yes.
I'm going to switch over to show you his site.
Wrong screen.
So Ben has created something called the Killam Bear Center. Ben Killam rehabilitates black bears, brown bears. Brown bears can be black. Anyway, so he actually developed strategies and techniques to take orphaned bears. Their mothers are often killed by human conflict or whatever, taking bears and raising them to be reinserted into the wild. And he developed ways to do this so that they would basically be able to be wild bears. And it's an amazing book, and you should check it out. But what totally blew me away, and this has happened multiple times since, is that because he spent time with the bears, he became their mother. And not only while he was raising them, but when he inserted them back into the wild and they became full-grown independent bears, he was still a part of their family and respected and integrated in to wild bear families. And so he learned, for example, that bears have a strong sense of justice, of right and wrong. And it's basically the mother bear gets to decide everything in their pack. But incredibly complex, incredibly sophisticated, clearly sentient creatures. And what Ben has shown with black bears, and what many other sciences have shown with so many other species, is that they're just like us. We're just like them. We're not special and unique, we're all special and unique. We're not better than these other species. We're just different. And this book really changed the way I see bears, obviously, and just in general, thinking about non-humans. So I encourage you to check it out. The Killam Bear Center is a 501c3. You can donate and help them do their rehabilitation. The money will be extremely well spent. Thank you. So you can stop the share there. And just one more thought for you. You might have seen that I'm wearing this little brace on my arm. I do a lot. I spend probably 10 to 15 hours a week outdoors, cutting invasives, cutting back vines, pulling down trees, dragging them around. And I'm so obsessed, I overdo it and generally strain my elbows and wrists and so on. So my elbow's sore. But I thought I'd tell you guys about one really cool device, which is called a Theraband. And it's, if you have any issues with tendonitis, it's really a fantastic device in which you twist and you hold your arm out and it untwists and it really works your tendons nicely. So if you're having problems with tendonitis in your elbows, check out Therabands. And there are a lot of other.
And we are not sponsors of Therabands, by the way.
No, we do not sponsor Theraband. And
there are heart recommendation here.
There are lots of similar variations, but it's a really helpful little tool. Okay, do we have any other comments?
Oh, we did. We had one from Tufik again.
Any utility to easily log all parameters of a procedure being called automatically. Oh, wouldn't that be nice? So the answer is no. And certainly, when I was with Oracle, I had direct insider contact with the PL SQL team, and we definitely talked about it, and they have looked at doing automatic tracing. I mean, it is kind of sad that in the world of PL SQL, we have to instrument our code with all these glorified calls to dbms output.putline, essentially. Not just glorified, better, writing out to a table, whatever. Because you can't get that to be done automatically. There is tracing that goes on, low-level database tracing, but none of it has application data in it. Here's the problem to Feek. It has to do with privacy and data security. Obviously, these days, we have to be very concerned about what people can see and what we're allowed to see of other people's data. And if we automatically trace every parameter value coming in, we might write into these logs sensitive data that is not intended to be shared or stored or seen. So the feeling, I think, inside Oracle is that it's something we'd love to do for you, but we don't see a way to do it safely. Now, that may change. They may give you the switch that you can say, hey, I really want this anyway. But that's why you don't have that kind of automated gathering right now. And the only real thing to do about it is to generate. So if I was writing a procedure, I had my API, and I'll be sharing one with you, built on Apex Debug relatively soon, I think. What I might do, if I wanted to log all parameters, and I had like 15, 20 parameters, what I might do is write a little code generator. So it's not that hard to write a program against all parameters or user parameters and get the parameters for a given program unit and just write a little codelet that generates out 15 calls to your add parameter interface, for example, in Logger. So that's not as good as automating it, but it's a lot better than writing it. That's the best I think I can offer right now.
I noticed, Stephen, you're still saying we when you refer to Oracle. Some habits are hard to break.
Well, actually, that was only in the context of I was saying that, if Oracle were going to do this. But yes, that's right. Still not. I think if we go back and look at the transcript, I'll be okay.
I will be sure to do that.
And it's probably good to point out I'm not with Oracle, because somebody else pointed out on Twitter today that my blog posts, my bio on oracle.com sites still says I'm a developer advocate for Oracle. Hopefully they'll catch up at some point. I've requested that. All right. Well, hopefully that was of interest to all of you, both the tip and the book and the exercise regime. And we'll be back next week with another tip. Feel free to send us feedback on Twitter or otherwise. Thank you, Judith. It's not all parameters, it's all arguments. And there is there are a bunch of gotchas in terms of using that thing. But yeah, that's why I'm saying you would want to generate the code rather than trying to get it dynamically and generically. Okay, yeah, so thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next week, and have a great week. Happy coding. Stay safe, stay masked. Please do not make the COVID pandemic any worse than it already is. It's going in the wrong direction. So please contribute to putting the thing to rest.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone. Bye.